Jonathan's breath hitched as he saw the paper slip from Mason's folder. It fluttered under the seat in front of them, just within reach. A single word, bold and unmistakable, caught his eye before Mason could snatch it back. Headquarters. His pulse pounded. This wasn't just some disgruntled passenger venting. This was a direct threat, and it was happening now. Jordan's face paled as he, too, caught a glimpse of the document. His hesitation was evident. "Mason, what is this?" Mason's jaw tightened, his fingers clenching the folder like a lifeline. "It's nothing. Stick to the plan." Jordan shook his head, his voice quieter, uncertain. "You said we were making a statement. You didn't say anything about—" Jonathan didn't wait. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. "Flight attendant!" His voice cut through the hum of the cabin, drawing startled gazes. Mason's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with realization. Jonathan knew. "But before we dive deeper into this intense moment, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one." Jonathan Cole adjusted the brim of his cap, pulling it low over his brow as he stepped onto the plane. The familiar hum of the engines and the faint scent of disinfectant greeted him, blending seamlessly into the background of a routine flight. Dressed in worn jeans, a faded hoodie, and sneakers that had seen better days, he looked like just another tired traveler, blending into the steady stream of passengers finding their seats. No one gave him a second glance, which was exactly what he wanted. As the CEO of Aerosky Airlines, one of the fastest-growing carriers in the country, he had built his company from the ground up. He had fought for every contract, negotiated every deal, and had spent years ensuring his airline stood for quality, safety, and accessibility. But despite his success, despite the awards and the headlines praising his achievements as one of the few black executives in aviation, he knew how the world really worked. Bias wasn't something you could erase with a corporate statement or a diversity initiative. It lingered in boardrooms, whispered through executive meetings, and seeped into customer service interactions. He had seen it firsthand. Passengers who assumed he was just another employee rather than the man who owned the airline. Investors who hesitated to back a black entrepreneur in a field dominated by old money and legacy companies. Numbers and reports could only tell him so much. To truly understand what his airline was doing right or wrong, he had to be in the thick of it, experiencing what his passengers and employees saw every day. That was why he was here, in an economy-class seat near the middle of the plane, instead of flying first class or reviewing spreadsheets from the comfort of his office. He had done this before, traveling incognito to get an unfiltered look at the customer experience. Usually, these flights were uneventful. Today, however, would be different. As he settled into his seat, adjusting his carry-on in the overhead compartment before buckling in, he heard voices behind him, low, urgent, and filled with something he couldn't quite place. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but something about the tone made him pause. The older voice, rough and edged with bitterness, belonged to a man in his 50s. The younger one, hesitant yet eager, sounded like someone still finding his place in the world. Jonathan let his gaze drift to the safety pamphlet in the seat back pocket, pretending to read while he listened. "I'm telling you, this airline is about to get what it deserves," the older man muttered. "People like him think they can buy their way out of history." Jonathan's fingers tightened around the pamphlet. He forced his expression to remain neutral, but inside his pulse quickened. He had spent years dealing with criticism, had heard every possible accusation thrown at him and his company. But there was something different about this. This wasn't just frustration. It sounded like a plan. He kept still, barely breathing as the conversation continued. Jonathan's pulse hammered in his ears, but his face remained impassive. Years in high-stakes negotiations had taught him the power of restraint, the ability to mask reaction behind a calm exterior. He forced himself to exhale slowly, steadying his breath, keeping his posture relaxed as if he hadn't just overheard something that sent a chill down his spine. His mind moved fast, dissecting every word. The older man's voice carried a weight of certainty, a quiet menace that spoke of conviction, not idle complaining. This wasn't just some frustrated passenger venting about delayed flights or baggage fees. There was intent behind his words, something calculated. And then there was the younger one, less sure of himself, his responses coming slower, almost as if he were second-guessing whatever they had planned. That hesitation stood out. If there was a weak link in this duo, it was him. Jonathan resisted the urge to glance over his shoulder, instead shifting slightly in his seat as if adjusting for comfort. He focused on the hum of the engines, grounding himself in the familiar rhythm, keeping his mind sharp. Reacting now would accomplish nothing. If they realized someone was listening, they might shut down completely, or worse, accelerate whatever they had in motion. He needed information, not confrontation. Staying quiet was the only move that made sense. He didn't know the full scope of their plan, but one thing was clear. They weren't just talking about Aerosky as an airline, they were talking about him. He felt the weight of his position settle over him in a way it hadn't in a long time. Being a black CEO in a field dominated by old money and legacy families had never been easy. He had spent years proving himself, fighting for legitimacy, making sure his work spoke louder than any assumptions about him. But no amount of success ever erased the undercurrent of resentment that some people carried. The idea that a man like him could build something this big, this powerful, it unsettled certain people. And now here he was, sitting just inches away from two men who saw his existence not as a success story, but as a problem to be solved. He adjusted his cap slightly, angling it lower, making sure his face remained in shadow. The flight was still boarding, passengers still moving through the aisles, the flight attendants greeting people with polished smiles. Normalcy wrapped around him like a thin veil, but beneath it, tension coiled tight in his gut. He had a choice to make. He could flag a flight attendant, quietly report what he had heard, and let airport security handle it once they landed. That would be the logical, safe move. Or he could wait, listen, and figure out exactly what these men were planning before making his move. His gut told him to wait. Information was power, and right now, power meant keeping his head down and his ears open. Mason let out a quiet chuckle, the kind that held no humor, just a deep-rooted bitterness. You know what the problem is, kid? These corporate elites, they pretend to care. They make their speeches, fund a few programs, slap a diversity slogan on their website, and suddenly they're the good guys. But nothing changes. Not really. People like us, we're still scraping by while they rake in millions. His voice was low but sharp, each word carrying weight. Jonathan kept his breathing steady, resisting the urge to turn his head even slightly. He could feel the venom in Mason's tone, a resentment that had been simmering for a long time. Jordan hesitated before responding, his voice quieter, uncertain. I get it, but isn't something better than nothing? Some of these programs help people, don't they? Mason scoffed. That's the lie they sell you. They do just enough to look good while making sure the system stays exactly the same. Aerosky? No different. You think that CEO, what's his name, Jonathan Cole, gives a damn about us? He's just another suit playing the game, keeping his seat at the table while the rest of us are stuck fighting for scraps. Jonathan felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. He'd heard variations of this argument before, the assumption that because he had succeeded, he had somehow sold out, abandoned his roots, become part of the very machine that oppressed others. It was an accusation that stung because he had spent his entire career trying to prove otherwise. He had pushed for real hiring initiatives, invested in underserved communities, created pathways for young people of color to break into aviation, but to someone like Mason, none of that mattered. Jordan shifted in his seat. So, what exactly are we doing then? I get that we want to make a statement, but... He trailed off, as if waiting for Mason to give him the right words to latch onto. Mason's tone turned sharper. We're showing them they don't run the world without consequences, and we've got the backing to make sure they hear us loud and clear. Jonathan's fingers curled into his palm beneath the tray table. A financial backer. That changed things. This wasn't just some angry guy with a grudge trying to cause a scene. If they had real funding, that meant organization. That meant reach. That meant whatever they were planning wasn't just a protest, it was something bigger. Jordan lowered his voice. You really trust them? The people funding this? Mason's response came without hesitation. "I trust that they want the same thing we do, to expose these frauds for what they are. And they've got the resources to do it, right?" Jonathan forced himself to keep his breathing even, his body language casual, but inside his mind was racing. This wasn't just about Aerosky. This was about him. Someone, somewhere, had decided he was the enemy, and they were willing to put serious money behind making him pay for it. Jonathan let his eyes drift toward the front of the plane, where a flight attendant in first class was carefully setting down a tray for a well-dressed businessman. The contrast between the two cabins was stark. Up front, passengers reclined in wide leather seats, sipping complimentary champagne, murmuring in low, content voices. Back in economy, people were still settling in, shifting in their tighter seats, adjusting bags in the overhead compartments, and angling for elbow room. The air felt different in both spaces. A sudden, sharp voice cut through the hum of conversation. "I said no ice," a man in first class snapped, his tone dripping with impatience. "Do I have to repeat myself?" Jonathan's gaze flicked to the aisle where Evelyn, a senior flight attendant who had likely worked in the industry for decades, stood holding a drink tray. She was a woman in her 60s with tired but kind eyes, her uniform crisp despite the long shift ahead. She remained professional, nodding slightly as she retrieved the offending glass and replaced it with a fresh one. "My apologies, sir," she said smoothly. The businessman scoffed and muttered under his breath, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Typical, slow service and they still can't get it right." Jonathan's jaw clenched, his fingers pressing into the armrest. He had seen this too many times before, the way some people spoke down to service workers as if they were beneath them, the way they expected perfection without an ounce of basic respect. And Evelyn, having undoubtedly dealt with worse over the years, simply kept moving, not even allowing the insult to register on her face. That was what made it worse. She was used to it. Behind him, Mason exhaled a quiet chuckle. "See, that's how they treat their own people." Jonathan forced himself not to react, but Mason's words sliced through him. He knew exactly what Mason was doing, using this moment as evidence, as fuel to feed Jordan's growing resentment. He was shaping the narrative, reinforcing the idea that no matter how hard you worked, no matter how professional you were, the system still found a way to keep you small. And the truth was, Jonathan couldn't argue that racism didn't exist. He had lived it, had fought through it. But he also knew that Mason's bitterness wasn't the answer. Jordan shifted in his seat, clearly affected by what he had just witnessed. "Yeah," he murmured, more to himself than to Mason. "It's messed up." Mason leaned in, his voice low but firm. "That's why we don't play by their rules, because their rules were never meant for us." Jonathan exhaled slowly, keeping his expression neutral, but his mind was working furiously. He could see the divide forming, the way Jordan was being pulled in piece by piece, and if Mason had his way, that anger would be molded into something dangerous. Jonathan had spent years proving that success didn't mean abandoning where you came from. But Mason wanted war, and if Jordan kept listening, he might just give it to him. A sudden jolt rocked the plane, sending a ripple of gasps through the cabin. Overhead compartments rattled, and a few loose items slipped from tray tables. The fastened seatbelt sign dinged on with an urgent chime as the plane lurched again, a sharper drop this time. A baby wailed somewhere toward the front. The flight attendants, seasoned professionals, moved swiftly to reassure passengers, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. Jordan sucked in a sharp breath, his hands gripping the armrests like they were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. His knuckles turned white as he braced himself for another jolt. Mason, however, sat relaxed, his arms folded across his chest, completely unbothered by the sudden turbulence. He turned slightly toward Jordan and smirked. "This just proves how unsafe this airline is. But what do you expect? You think they actually care about whether this plane holds together?" His voice was just low enough to be heard over the shifting murmurs of unease around them. Jonathan caught the flicker of uncertainty in Jordan's eyes. The young man still looked rattled, but his expression had shifted from pure fear to something else. Hesitation. Doubt. Jonathan had seen this look before, the moment when someone stood on the edge of a belief, wavering between conviction and second-guessing everything they had been told. Mason, either unaware or simply uninterested in Jordan's hesitation, pressed on. "I told you, kid, these big companies, especially ones run by guys like Cole, they don't build for us, they build for profit. Always cutting corners, always taking the cheap way out. Sooner or later, it catches up." Jonathan knew exactly what Mason was doing. He wasn't just making conversation. He was planting a seed. He was twisting fear into justification, reinforcing the idea that Aerosky, that Jonathan himself, was part of a system built to fail people like them, and Jordan, shaken and vulnerable in the moment, was the perfect target. The plane jolted again, but this time the movement was less severe. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, steady and composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a bit of turbulence. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just some rough air ahead. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We should be through it shortly." Jonathan saw Jordan's grip on the armrests loosen slightly. He was calming down, but his mind was still processing everything Mason had just said. Jonathan wanted to say something, to interject, to plant a different kind of seed before Mason's words took full root, but he knew now wasn't the time. Instead, someone else stepped in. Evelyn appeared beside them, her voice calm, her presence a quiet reassurance. "Everything all right here?" she asked, her eyes sweeping over Jordan, who still looked tense. "You hanging in there, sweetheart?" Jordan blinked, caught off guard by the gentleness in her tone. Yeah?" he muttered, though his voice wasn't entirely steady. Evelyn gave him a knowing look, the kind only someone with years of experience could give. "First time flying?" Jordan shook his head. No, just wasn't expecting that." Evelyn smiled, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "Happens to the best of us. You'd be surprised how many people still grab onto the seat like it's their last hope, no matter how many times they've flown. But trust me, turbulence is normal. It's just the wind reminding us who's really in charge up here." Jordan exhaled a small laugh, barely more than a breath, but it was enough. The tightness in his shoulders eased, and his grip on the armrest finally loosened. Jonathan watched him, noting the way he looked at Evelyn. Not just as a flight attendant, but as a person. Evelyn's eyes flickered briefly to Mason, but she didn't linger. Instead, she gave Jordan a reassuring pat on the shoulder before moving on down the aisle to check on the other passengers. Jonathan didn't miss the way Jordan's eyes followed her for a moment, thoughtful, conflicted. Mason had spent the entire flight feeding Jordan the idea that the system was rigged against them, that people like Evelyn were nothing more than disposable workers in a machine that would never truly value them. But here she was, kind, patient, and steady, in direct contrast to everything Mason had been preaching. Jordan sat back in his seat, arms now resting loosely at his sides. His gaze drifted toward the window, where the clouds outside were beginning to smooth out as the turbulence passed. Jonathan could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the cracks forming in the foundation Mason had spent so much time laying. For the first time since the flight began, Jonathan allowed himself the smallest flicker of hope. The turbulence faded, but the tension in the cabin remained thick, an invisible charge in the air. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, punctuated by nervous laughter from passengers trying to shake off the lingering unease. Flight attendants moved smoothly through the aisle, checking on passengers, collecting discarded cups, and restoring a sense of normalcy. Jonathan kept his breathing even, his face neutral, but his mind was racing. He could still feel the weight of Mason's words pressing against him, planting doubt and distrust in Jordan's mind. He had seen this kind of manipulation before. The slow, deliberate poisoning of perspective, the reshaping of truth into something bitter and dangerous. Mason knew exactly what he was doing, and Jordan was still vulnerable enough to be molded into whatever Mason needed him to be. Mason shifted in his seat, clearly growing restless. He pulled a thick folder from his bag, flipping through its contents with an impatient air, as if reaffirming his plans. Jonathan wasn't the only one who noticed. Jordan frowned slightly, leaning in, his voice lower than before. "So, what exactly is the plan?" Mason exhaled sharply, tapping his fingers against the paper. "The plan," he murmured, is to make sure this whole damn country knows exactly who Jonathan Cole really is. Jonathan's fingers tightened on his tray table, though his face remained impassive. Jordan glanced around quickly before speaking again. Yeah, but what are we actually doing? You've been vague this whole time. Mason smirked, flipping a page. You'll see soon enough. Everything's set. We're hitting them where it hurts. Jordan didn't respond, but Jonathan caught the way his shoulders tensed, the flicker of unease crossing his face. Then, in a split second, turbulence struck again, just a small, unexpected jolt, nothing serious, but enough to startle Mason. His grip on the folder slipped, and before he could react, the papers tumbled onto the floor, sliding partially under the seat in front of them. Jonathan didn't move, didn't even glance directly at the mess, but his brain locked onto the moment with razor-sharp focus. His peripheral vision took in everything: pages covered in bold, printed text, lists of names and locations, and something that sent a chill down his spine. A flyer with Aerosky's headquarters address printed in thick black ink. His mind absorbed the details in an instant. A date, 2 days from now. A location, Aerosky's main office in Chicago. A phrase printed in large, bold letters: no justice, no peace. And something else, scribbled in the margins. An unfamiliar name followed by a dollar amount. A financial backer. Mason cursed under his breath, scrambling to collect the papers, hastily shoving them back into the folder before anyone else could see. Jordan bent down to help, glancing at one of the pages before handing it back. Jonathan caught the flicker of something in his eyes. Hesitation. Doubt. He had seen the address too. He knew where this was heading. Mason zipped the folder shut and shot Jordan a pointed look. Careful what you ask for, kid. You're either all in or you're in the way. Jordan swallowed hard and nodded, but Jonathan could see it now. Mason's grip on him wasn't as tight as it had been at the start of the flight. The cracks were forming. Jonathan just had to find the right moment to break them wide open. A sharp gasp cut through the low hum of the cabin, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy slumping against a seat. A woman's voice let out a panicked, breathless cry. "Oh my God! Somebody help!" Heads turned. A man in first class shot to his feet, frantically waving his arms. "She just collapsed," he shouted. For a second, there was a stunned silence. Then the cabin exploded into motion. A flight attendant rushed toward the commotion, her voice steady but urgent as she called over the intercom. "We have a medical emergency on board. If there's a doctor or nurse on this flight, please identify yourself immediately." Jonathan twisted slightly in his seat, catching a glimpse of the scene unfolding just beyond the curtain separating first class. A woman, middle-aged, dressed in an expensive navy blazer, was slumped over, her head resting limply against the seat. Her pale face was slick with sweat, chest rising and falling in quick, uneven breaths. Before he could process anything further, movement beside him caught his attention. Jordan shot up from his seat without hesitation. "She needs help," he muttered, pushing past Mason before the older man could stop him. Mason scowled, reaching out as if to pull him back. "Sit down, kid. This isn't our problem." Jordan ignored him, already stepping into the aisle. He wasn't a doctor, wasn't a paramedic, but something in him refused to just sit there and do nothing. He hesitated only for a moment, scanning the small crowd forming in first class. No one seemed to be doing anything other than staring, frozen by uncertainty. Then Evelyn moved. Jonathan watched as the older flight attendant pushed past the murmuring passengers with absolute authority. Her posture, her presence, there was no hesitation, no doubt. In that moment, she was the only person in the room who knew exactly what needed to be done. "Give her space," Evelyn ordered, her voice sharp and commanding. She dropped to one knee beside the woman, placing 2 fingers against her neck. Her brows furrowed as she counted. "Pulse is weak. She's sweating heavily. Sir, do you know if she has any medical conditions?" she asked the frantic man hovering nearby. "She's my wife," he stammered. She's diabetic, but she took her insulin this morning. Evelyn nodded, already moving. "Could be low blood sugar. We need juice or soda." Now. A younger flight attendant sprinted toward the galley, vanishing behind the curtain. Evelyn tilted the woman's head back slightly, checking her airway, her movements quick and precise. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" she called gently. The woman's eyelids fluttered, her lips parting, but no words came out. Jordan stood frozen, watching every move Evelyn made. The way she stayed calm, the way she took control while everyone else panicked. It was the exact opposite of everything Mason had been whispering in his ear for the past hour. Mason had painted people like Evelyn as powerless, as nothing more than cogs in a machine built to serve the wealthy. But here she was, leading, saving a life while the rich passengers around her stood uselessly in shock. The flight attendant returned with a can of orange juice, passing it to Evelyn, who quickly popped the tab and brought it to the woman's lips. "Small sips," she instructed. Slowly, color began to return to the woman's face. Her breathing steadied. The husband let out a ragged sigh, relief washing over him. Passengers began murmuring words of amazement. A few even clapped lightly. Jonathan didn't miss the way Jordan exhaled, his shoulders dropping, as if something in him had just clicked into place. He didn't say a word as he slowly stepped back toward his seat, his expression unreadable. He lowered himself down without looking at Mason, but Jonathan could see the conflict, the questions racing through his mind. Evelyn had just shattered everything Mason had tried to convince him of, and for the first time since the flight took off, Jordan didn't look entirely sure whose side he was on. Jordan sank into his seat, staring straight ahead, his mind clearly somewhere else. The hum of the engines, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional chime from the cockpit, all of it faded into the background. He had just watched a woman nearly die, and the person who saved her wasn't a doctor, wasn't some rich executive. It was Evelyn. The same flight attendant Mason had dismissed as nothing more than a pawn in a broken system, the same woman who had shown him kindness when he was panicked during the turbulence. He replayed the moment over and over. The way Evelyn had taken control, how she hadn't hesitated, how the wealthy passengers in first class had just stood there, waiting for someone else to act. He thought about Mason's words, the way he had painted this airline as another cold corporation that didn't care about people like them. But if that were true, then why was Evelyn there? Why had she done what she did? Why did it feel like everything Mason had told him wasn't as clear-cut as it had seemed an hour ago? Jonathan, still feigning disinterest, kept his gaze fixed on the in-flight magazine in his hands, but he didn't turn the page. He didn't have to. He could feel the shift happening beside him. Jordan was unraveling, his beliefs twisting, reshaping, battling each other in real time. It was subtle, the way his fingers tapped restlessly against his knee, the furrow between his brows, the slight shake of his head as if arguing with a voice in his own mind. He was questioning, and that meant Mason was losing his grip. Mason, on the other hand, seemed unfazed. He exhaled through his nose, shifting slightly in his seat, adjusting his jacket like he hadn't just watched his young recruit nearly slip from his grasp. "Don't get it twisted, kid," he muttered, keeping his voice low. "One act of kindness doesn't erase years of discrimination." Jordan blinked, turning his head just enough to glance at Mason. His expression was guarded now, no longer as open, no longer as eager to nod along. "I didn't say it did," he murmured. Mason smirked, shaking his head. "I see what's happening. You're getting caught up in the moment. That's how they get you. They throw you a little bit of humanity, make you think things aren't so bad, and before you know it, you're back to believing the system actually gives a damn about you." Jordan's fingers curled against his knee, his jaw tightening. "She saved a life," he said, quieter this time. Mason shrugged. "And? You think that means she's any less replaceable to them? She clocked into this flight knowing damn well she's underpaid, overworked, and expected to smile through every insult thrown her way. She did her job, just like she always does. And when this flight lands, she'll go home and do it all again tomorrow, while the people in first class don't think twice about what happened here. That's reality, kid." Jonathan felt the weight of Mason's words settle in the space between them, pressing down on Jordan like a slow, creeping poison. He knew exactly what Mason was doing, twisting truth with manipulation, using cynicism as a weapon. And it was working. Jordan's face hardened, his expression closing off. But Jonathan also saw something else beneath the surface, something Mason couldn't see because he was too busy controlling the narrative: doubt. It was still there, lurking beneath the anger. Jordan wasn't fully convinced anymore. Jordan exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly, like he was trying to push the whole conversation out of his mind. But Jonathan knew better. That seed of doubt had been planted, and no matter how much Mason tried to bury it, it was already taking root. The plane touched down with a jolt, tires screeching against the runway as the engines roared in reverse. Around Jonathan, passengers exhaled in relief, stretching limbs and reaching for their phones, eager to return to their lives. But Jonathan remained still, his pulse steady, his focus locked on Mason and Jordan. The real turbulence was still ahead. As soon as the seatbelt sign flicked off, Mason was on his feet, his movements sharp and impatient. Jordan followed, but with noticeably less urgency, his eyes darting around as if lost in thought. The moment with Evelyn had shaken something loose in him, Jonathan could tell. He wasn't moving with the same blind conviction he had at the start of the flight. He hesitated before grabbing his bag, his fingers flexing around the strap as if trying to hold on to something solid. Jonathan unbuckled his belt and rose to his feet, slipping seamlessly into the flow of disembarking passengers. He kept his pace measured, ensuring he remained close, but not too close. He needed to see where they were going, what their next move was. Mason, however, was all business, cutting through the crowd with a singular focus. As they reached the narrow jet bridge leading into the terminal, Jonathan heard Mason murmur something low to Jordan. "Stay sharp. We don't have time for doubts." Jordan said nothing. The three of them filtered into the terminal, the bright fluorescent lights casting an almost sterile glow over the bustling space. Travelers rushed past, dragging suitcases, reuniting with loved ones, or staring blankly at arrival screens. The contrast between the normalcy of the airport and the weight of what was unfolding was jarring. Jonathan kept his distance as Mason led Jordan toward the baggage claim area, weaving through the crowds with practiced efficiency. But just as they neared the security exit, a sharp beep rang out, followed by the unmistakable sound of a TSA officer's voice. "Sir, step aside, please." Jordan froze. Mason turned, his expression snapping from impatience to something much colder. Jordan hesitated before stepping toward the security officer, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What? What's wrong?" The TSA agent gestured to Jordan's backpack, which he had slung over one shoulder. "Your bag triggered an alert. We need to take a look." Jonathan saw it happen in real time. The moment Mason realized the situation was no longer convenient for him, the second he calculated that Jordan was now a liability instead of an asset. His jaw tightened, his fingers flexing at his sides. But instead of waiting or offering any support, he took a step back. Then another. And then he turned. Just like that, Mason disappeared into the crowd without a single glance back. Jordan blinked, his brain clearly scrambling to process what just happened. "Wait." He turned, expecting Mason to be beside him, but he wasn't. He was already gone. His breath hitched slightly, his shoulders tensing. Jonathan knew this was the moment. He stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "He left you, Jordan." Jordan's head whipped around, his eyes wide, defensive. "What?" Jonathan took another step, close enough now to really look him in the eyes. "Mason, he left the second you became inconvenient." Jordan shook his head, his jaw clenching. "No, he probably just—" "He made his choice," Jonathan cut in. "Now you have to make yours." The TSA agent cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "Sir, we need to inspect your bag." Jordan's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his mind clearly racing. His fingers gripped the strap of his backpack tightly before, finally, he let out a breath and handed it over. Jonathan didn't move. He just watched as the first real cracks in Mason's grip on Jordan shattered completely. Jordan stood frozen as the TSA agent unzipped his backpack, his breaths coming in shallow, rapid bursts. His gaze flickered toward the crowd, scanning desperately for Mason, but he was gone, vanished without a trace. The agent methodically rifled through the bag, pulling out a few folded papers, a laptop, a hoodie, nothing suspicious. Jordan's fingers twitched at his sides, his body rigid with tension. Jonathan watched the emotions play out across his face. Confusion, anger, betrayal. The younger man was unraveling, caught between everything he had believed and the undeniable reality that Mason had abandoned him the moment things got difficult. Then, just as Jordan's shoulders began to slump, a familiar voice cut through the noise like a blade. Well, look at this. The great Jonathan Cole swooping in to save the day. Mason. Jonathan turned sharply, spotting him a few feet away, arms crossed, his smirk laced with venom. His posture was relaxed, too relaxed, the smug arrogance of a man who thought he was untouchable. His eyes, however, burned with something deeper. Hatred. Jordan flinched at Mason's voice, spinning to face him, his expression twisted with confusion. Where the hell did you go? Mason barely spared him a glance. Doesn't matter. His attention was locked onto Jonathan now, his lips curling into a sneer. You must feel real proud of yourself, watching from your throne, thinking you're better than the rest of us, but you're not. You're just another suit who sold out to the highest bidder. Jonathan met Mason's glare, his face calm, but his voice like steel. And what exactly did I sell out, Mason? Mason scoffed. You built your fortune playing their game, pretending you're different, pretending you actually care, but you're just like every other corporate puppet. You wave around charity work and diversity initiatives like a shield, thinking it protects you, but at the end of the day, you're part of the same machine that keeps people like us struggling. He took a step closer, his voice lowering but dripping with venom. You think a few scholarships make up for centuries of oppression? You think hiring a handful of black employees erases the fact that people like you climb to the top and leave the rest of us behind? Jonathan inhaled slowly, holding Mason's gaze. The old him, the one fresh out of college, hungry to prove himself, might have snapped back, might have met anger with anger. But he had learned a long time ago that true power wasn't in the loudest voice. It was in control. You think I don't know what it's like to fight for a seat at the table? Jonathan's voice was even, steady, but it carried weight, the weight of experience, of lived truth. You think I don't know what it's like to be told I don't belong, to be dismissed before I even open my mouth, to work twice as hard, be twice as perfect, just to be seen as barely enough? He stepped forward, closing the space between them. I know what it's like to be underestimated, but I didn't let it define me. I didn't let it make me bitter, and I sure as hell didn't use it as an excuse to destroy something built to help people who look like us. Mason let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Help? You think you're helping? Yes, Jonathan said simply. I do, and the fact that you can't see that says more about you than it does about me. Mason's jaw clenched, his fingers curling into fists. His rage was boiling over, barely contained beneath the surface. You're just a puppet dancing for them. And the worst part? You actually believe you're making a difference. Jonathan's expression didn't waver. Change doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen by burning everything down. It happens by doing the work, by staying in the fight even when it's exhausting, even when it feels impossible. It happens by proving we belong in these spaces instead of demanding them to burn. His eyes flicked to Jordan, who stood between them, his breathing uneven, his hands clenched at his sides. And it happens by lifting people up, not using them as pawns for your personal war. Jordan flinched, his eyes welling with something raw and painful. He looked at Mason, then at Jonathan, then back again, his face twisting as reality crashed down on him. His voice trembled. You used me. Mason's head snapped toward him, his expression hardening. No, kid, I showed you the truth. Jordan shook his head violently. No, you didn't. You fed me your anger. You made me think this was about justice, but it's not. It's about you, about your grudge. His breath hitched, and then, to Jonathan's surprise, a tear slipped down his cheek. I believed you. Mason's face darkened. Then you're weaker than I thought. Jordan's entire body tensed as if he had been punched in the gut. His lip trembled, but something else flickered in his eyes now. Realization, hurt, and worst of all, shame. Jonathan exhaled slowly and turned to Jordan, his voice softer now. You don't have to follow him. You don't have to be him. Jordan swallowed hard, his shoulders shaking. I don't know what to do. Jonathan placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. Then let's start with the truth. Jordan stood there, his breathing uneven, his eyes glassy with the weight of everything that had just unraveled in front of him. Mason was still glaring at him, but the younger man no longer flinched under his gaze. The power Mason once held over him had cracked, leaving only the bitter remains of misplaced loyalty. Jonathan saw the conflict playing out on Jordan's face, the anger, the betrayal, the uncertainty of what came next. The TSA officer, now joined by airport security, stepped forward, their presence a stark reminder that this situation wasn't just emotional. There were consequences. One of the officers turned to Jonathan. Mr. Cole, would you like to press charges? Jordan's breath hitched, his fingers curled into fists at his sides, but not in defiance. He was bracing for whatever came next. Jonathan studied him for a long moment, then turned to the officer. His voice was firm. No. Jordan's head snapped up, his expression twisting in confusion. Mason scoffed, shaking his head in disgust, but Jonathan ignored him. He wasn't doing this for Mason. He was doing this for the young man standing in front of him, the one who had almost been lost to the same bitterness and resentment Mason had drowned in long ago. The officer frowned. Are you sure? He was clearly involved. Jonathan nodded. I'm sure. He was manipulated, and I don't believe his future should be decided by one mistake. Jordan's throat bobbed, his face crumbling with something raw and unfiltered. Shame, relief, disbelief. He blinked rapidly, trying to hold himself together, but his voice cracked when he finally spoke. Why? Jonathan kept his gaze steady. Because I see a young man who wants to do the right thing but got caught up in the wrong fight. You wanted justice. You just didn't realize the man leading you had no idea what that really meant. Mason let out a sharp laugh. Spare me this sermon. The kid made his choice. You let people like him off the hook, and they just end up running right back into the same cycle. Jonathan finally turned to face Mason fully, his voice like steel. And what's your excuse? You're not some lost kid. You made your choices, and you knew exactly what you were doing. Mason smirked, but there was no real amusement in it. And I'd do it again. The officers didn't wait for any more words. They stepped in, cuffing Mason's hands behind his back. He didn't fight, he didn't shout. He just stared at Jonathan with a look that said he wasn't done, that this wasn't over. But Jonathan had seen his type before. Men who had let their pain consume them so completely that they couldn't see anything else. There was no reasoning with them, no pulling them back from the fire they had willingly stepped into. As Mason was escorted away, Jonathan turned back to Jordan. The younger man still looked like he was struggling to process what had just happened. You're not him, Jonathan said quietly. Jordan let out a shaky breath. I don't know who I am. Jonathan studied him for a long moment, then finally spoke. Then let's figure that out. If you really want to fight for something that matters, I have a place for you at Aerosky's community outreach program. Real change, real impact. But only if you're ready to put in the work. Jordan stared at him, raw hesitation in his eyes. Why would you even give me a chance after everything? Jonathan exhaled. Because someone once gave me one. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Then, slowly, Jordan nodded. It wasn't a confident nod. It wasn't the nod of someone who had it all figured out, but it was a start. And sometimes, that was enough. Jordan stood in the middle of a packed community center, his hands gripping the edge of a folding table as he helped sort through stacks of job applications and training brochures. Around him, young men and women shuffled in, some nervous, some eager, others skeptical. He saw pieces of himself in them, the same uncertainty, the same frustration, the same quiet hope that maybe, Just maybe someone would take a chance on them. Just months ago, he had been on the other side of this equation, believing he had to fight the system with anger instead of action. Now, he was learning that real change didn't come from destruction. It came from building something better. A woman approached, her voice hesitant. I don't even know where to start. I've never had a real interview before. Jordan offered her a reassuring nod and slid a pamphlet across the table. That's what we're here for. We'll walk you through it, step by step. Across the room, Jonathan leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching Jordan interact with the community members. He had taken a risk bringing the young man into this program, but it was paying off. Jordan had thrown himself into the work, not out of guilt, but out of a real need to make something of himself, to make something right. Jonathan exhaled slowly. This entire ordeal, from the whispered conversation on the plane to Mason's arrest, had started as a fight for his company's reputation. But somewhere along the way, he had realized it was about more than Aerosky. It was about how people like Jordan were being pulled into cycles of resentment and rage because they believed they had no other way to be heard. It was about showing them that justice wasn't just about calling out problems, it was about being part of the solution. Months passed, and life moved forward. Aerosky continued expanding, new routes were launched, and the controversy stirred by Mason's failed protest began to fade into the background. But Jonathan hadn't forgotten. One crisp autumn morning, he found himself stepping onto another flight, dressed down in jeans and a sweatshirt, his baseball cap pulled low. This time, he wasn't flying incognito to check operations. He wasn't here to test the efficiency of his airline or to see if the flight attendants met company standards. He was here to listen. As he settled into his seat, the conversations around him drifted in and out of focus. A woman behind him spoke in quiet Spanish, reassuring her child that they were going to a better place. A young man in the row ahead of him grumbled about struggling to find work, wondering if he'd ever get a real shot. An older man chuckled with a seatmate about the old days, swapping stories of struggle and perseverance. Jonathan let the voices wash over him, understanding now that all of these stories, of hope, of frustration, of survival, were connected. His work wasn't just about Aerosky's success. It was about making sure more people had the chance to write their own story, to take control of their own narrative. As the plane took off, Jonathan gazed out the window, a small smile playing at his lips. Change was never easy, but it was always worth the fight. Jonathan sat back in his seat, letting the quiet hum of the plane settle over him. The sky stretched endlessly outside the window, a vast expanse of possibility, of movement, of change. He had spent his life fighting to build something real, something lasting. He had faced doubt, discrimination, and outright resistance, and yet here he was, still standing, still pushing forward. But the question remained, was it enough? He thought of Jordan, of the moment the young man had realized he'd been used, of the hesitation in his voice when he asked Jonathan why he was giving him a second chance. That moment had stayed with him, because it wasn't just about Jordan. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel like they had to fight the system with rage alone, who had been taught that destruction was their only form of power. But power wasn't just in anger, it was in action, it was in truth, it was in refusing to let pain dictate the path forward. He turned the question over in his mind, then let the words settle into something deeper, something that wasn't just for himself, but for anyone who had ever stood at that same crossroads. Do we challenge injustice with truth and action, or do we let our pain drive us to destruction? The choice is ours. Change was never about tearing things down just to watch them burn. It was about building something better in its place. It was about recognizing the flaws in the system and working relentlessly to fix them. It was about refusing to accept easy answers and instead committing to the hard work of making things right. He exhaled slowly, letting his fingers tap absently against the tray table in front of him. The turbulence he had experienced months ago, the one that had shaken the plane, shaken Jordan, shaken everything, felt like a perfect metaphor. Turbulence was uncomfortable. It was unsettling. It could make people feel powerless, but it was also temporary. You could hold on. You could ride through it. And on the other side, there was still a destination waiting for you. Jonathan glanced around the cabin, watching the people lost in their own thoughts, their own journeys. Everyone carried something with them. Pain, hope, anger, ambition. But the truth was, none of them were alone in it. They just had to be willing to listen, to understand, to move forward together. Together. Change doesn't come from anger alone. It comes from courage, honesty, and the willingness to listen. As the plane soared higher, Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a quiet certainty settle in his chest. The work wasn't done, it never would be, but that was the point. You didn't stop just because the fight was hard. You kept going, and that made all the difference. Jonathan opened his eyes, the steady hum of the engines filling the quiet space around him. The journey he had taken, the one that started long before this flight, was far from over. But he wasn't alone in it. There were so many others out there, fighting their own battles, pushing against the weight of injustice, refusing to accept the world as it was. Their voices mattered. Their stories mattered. He knew this wasn't just about his experience. It was about all the moments, big and small, where people had chosen to stand up, to speak out, to challenge the system not with destruction, but with determination. And now, it was time to hear those stories. What about you? Have you ever faced discrimination? Have you ever had to push back against a system that tried to silence you? Have you ever stood up for someone who needed a voice? Your story matters. Share it in the comments below. Let's create a conversation, a movement, a space where real change begins with understanding. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of resilience, courage, and transformation. Because the fight for justice doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to all of us. Together, we can create a world where dignity isn't conditional, where opportunity isn't dictated by race or status, where the future is built on action, not anger. It starts with us. It starts now.